Our changing world, building resilience and sustainability in the LDCs. But can I just first say, sort of also on my behalf, how happy I am to see you all here. And I think that we really had a good day yesterday, and we talk much about, well, evidence-based policy making, but yesterday we really had evidence-based policy making because we had such interesting presentations with compelling facts and analysis on the many problems that sort of LDCs face, and sometimes when you sort of look at academic research, you have this feeling in a way of being confused, but on a higher level, but not yesterday, because I think that the findings and the conclusions were so eminently clear. So and this is a very good template in a way that we will now listen to analysis, research, data, facts, and I hope that this will sort of guide us in making sort of, well, good decisions in Doha in just a few months' time. But today our subject is resilience, and one of the main characteristics of the LDCs is really their vulnerability, and then resilience building and achieving sustainable development will have to be at the core of a new program of action. This session will focus on how LDCs can deal with the challenges of climate change. We all know that LDCs have contributed the least, but are among the most affected countries. Thus, they need to invest a lot in adaptation to climate change and in disaster preparedness to be able to achieve the SDGs. The bio information of our keynote speaker and panelists are available on the conference website, so I will only introduce them briefly to have more time for discussion. I would also like to ask speakers to stick to the agreed time and focus on their key findings that are relevant to policy makers. One feedback I heard yesterday was really in a way that, well, we are all eager to have an interactive element to our discussion, so I will try to keep time, and actually I will be clocking the panelists, so when sort of the my bell will start chiming in a way that your time is really up and it's time to move on. But our keynote speaker is Mr. Aroma Revi, Director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, who will make his presentation virtually, focusing on the convergence of climate and disaster resilience with sustainable development. You have the floor, please.
Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. I'm going to very quickly take you through a set of ideas that I'm sort of happy to share. I'm imagining that you can see my slide at the moment. So what I'm going to be speaking about is trying to build LDC resilience via the SDGs. And this comes from a number of decades of experience, not only on the MDGs and the SDGs, but also on dealing with climate change. I've been involved in the current assessments of the IPCC, and in the framing and the sort of tracking of, oh, I beg your pardon, sorry. That's a bit of a challenge. 1 second. Can we see what's happening just now? Is that good? Are we good? Excellent. So basically the question that we're trying to address is, in the context of core development challenges faced by the LDCs, this of course is a framework that we're familiar with. This is a sustainable development goals, and I've highlighted 3 clusters of goals, which I guess we've gone over in the last few days. The first one's the most obvious, dealing with poverty and zero hunger. Another cluster that's dealing with human development, health, education, and gender equality. One that's very critical to the LDCs, which deals with economic development. That's a fundamental challenge apart from human development, which is SDGs 8, 9, and 10, dealing with economic development, growth, industrialization, etc. And then, of course, the big challenges, 13, 14, and 15. And I've highlighted 14 and 15 because by and large, most LDCs are doing very well as far as the global framework is concerned in terms of climate action, because emissions are fairly low. But apart from the SDG framework, there are 3 other ideas that are part of the 2030 agenda that I think are very important to us. And that is the idea of leaving no one behind, the idea of leaving no place behind. And this is very critical for a whole range of LDCs and also SIDS who are LDCs. And finally, the idea of leaving no ecosystem behind, because if you're not able to deal with ecosystem challenges, we're in deep challenges, especially from the LDC context. So to be very frank, there are 3 high-level strategic constraints that we face from the LDC point of view. The first one, of course, is economic scale and diversity. Economies are not very large. It'll be a long time before LDCs find their way into the G20 or larger groupings of that kind. And economic diversity is relatively low, dependence on 1 or 2 major economic sectors to actually drive the economy and sort of take it forward, which is pretty important to dealing with poverty and hunger and resource mobilization. The other thing, of course, is very strong sensitivity to natural resources. And that's why ecosystem services and dealing with ecosystems is quite important. Plus, contexts are quite important. If you're a small island state, it's not only sea level rise that's going to affect you towards the latter part of the century, but certainly a whole range of other challenges that we're seeing with extreme climate events. And finally, we just heard just now, most of us are significantly impacted, whether it's droughts or it's extreme weather, or it's a whole range of other climate and disaster risk related kind of hazards. So impacts are very high, but the leverage we have, because we produce in a sense and sort of interact with the global environmental system somewhat less than other countries in the world, is quite low. So in a sense, these are strategic constraints that may not actually change, certainly in the 2020s, but even after that. So that's the context in which we're currently working. Given that, the big question is, what are we building resilience for? And this is one of my sort of favorite images from last year, where the COVID crisis seems like something that's kind of overtaken the world, what we call a set of cascading risks. COVID actually is a perfect SDG storm. It starts in SDG 3 around health, but then it permeates across the world and across most economies to touch most of the other SDGs. Poverty, work, a whole range of other questions, excepting in some cases, some of the environmental goals that we have. So they're basically 4 sets of shocks that we have to deal with. And from the LDC context, to be very frank, having worked in development for more than 3 decades, I think the most critical question for us is dealing with economic and livelihood shocks. We know that happens quite regularly. We've seen many cycles in this in the last 20 or 30 years. The most recent ones were 2008. And of course, the COVID-induced impacts that we're seeing just now. Then, of course, the climate emergency. And what we often forget is the biodiversity crisis is sitting just behind that and often tied to it. And that is going to have a very dramatic impact, certainly on food security and potentially on water security as we go forward. So, a set of these waves that are coming one after the other, smaller and bigger in some senses. So we really need to look at this as a systemic kind of opportunity. So my proposition here, both from practice and from some of the most interesting things that we've seen in the last many years since the SDGs, Sendai and Paris were negotiated, is that we need an integrated response which brings together climate action, biodiversity conservation, and disaster risk reduction. So notionally, the Paris, Aichi, and the Sendai agendas within the framework of sustainable development. Now, if you're a policymaker from an LDC, you can, the first reaction would be, this just can't work for us. We don't have the resources. We may not have the institutional capacity. We're in a very difficult situation. So you're asking too much for us. I'm going to make a contrarian argument that in actual fact, these are central to trying to achieve the SDG, the LDC objectives of achieving the SDGs. And there, if you were to unbundle it, there are three different things that we need to deal with. On the climate front, the most critical thing is climate adaptation to secure ecosystem services, because that's where food, water, air, and a whole range of things on which our people depend are absolutely critical, and they're going to become increasingly complicated because we are probably going to see an overshoot above 1.5 and maybe even 2, depending on what happens in the negotiations this year. And then, of course, dealing with settlement and infrastructure systems. SDG 11 is not only about cities, it's also about all other places. So it's a question of dealing with spatial justice and infrastructure, because one of the really critical things that's very difficult to establish in LDC environments is resilient infrastructure systems, whether it's schools or healthcare systems, or even roads, bridges, electronic infrastructure, etc. So you really need to protect that. And of course, climate mitigation is important, but I think it's important not because of emissions. It's important because we need universal access to clean energy. That's what's going to drive our economies. And of course, the longer you stay with fossil fuels staying out, there's going to be significant macroeconomic impacts, because many LDCs are not places where you have a large amount of fossil fuels that are currently available. So the transition risks are quite strong. And then, of course, biodiversity conservation, like I was saying earlier, is about food and water securities and sustainable cities and communities. You cannot do it without that. And finally, in the everyday working of things, it's not only the big events that are important, but what we call everyday risk around lives, around critical infrastructure and buildings, because you can see that, event after event, you can lose a lot of your building stock, and that, in a sense, is the accumulated savings and investments of maybe a couple of generations of people who are in rather difficult circumstances. Now, how can we think about this? When we're looking at risk, you can deal with risk by modifying the hazard. And that can be done by and large by a whole range of high-income countries, because this is expensive. Building seawalls, diverting rivers, dealing with the questions like that is actually quite complicated and difficult. The second thing is to sort of modify exposure by moving people from places where they are to other places, which is actually both difficult and very complex, given our livelihood and development challenges. So the real core opportunity for us is actually to decrease vulnerability. And effectively, decreasing vulnerability is implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's, and I would say, at the heart of the argument that I'm presenting just now. Decreasing vulnerability structurally across all forms and divisions, whether it's gender, ethnicity, location, etc., is central to what we want to do and what we have to do in time. So how do we do this in the climate context? There's a framework that we're talking about just now. It will be out, is currently in discussion from the IPCC. It's called climate resilient development, which basically means taking sustainable development and integrating adaptation more centrally for the SDGs, and also mitigation to make them work together. So it's, in a sense, what we would call a triple win. But the important thing to understand in this is you cannot deliver climate goals without delivering the SDGs in time and limiting maldevelopment. We have maldevelopment in many parts of the world. So development is a context in which climate action takes place. And if you don't address the challenges of development, especially in contexts where we have a whole range of operational challenges, it's going to become very difficult. The framework that we have from the IPCC, and I sort of co-led this process for the 1.5 report in 2018, is that we have to effect in this decade 5 critical system transitions. The most obvious one is on energy. I haven't highlighted it because in some senses, apart from access, that is something that may not be very critical for the LDCs to engage with. But the ones in red, dealing with the land and oceans ecosystems transition to ensure water, food security, and the availability of ecological services, whether it's in forests, or terrestrial areas, agricultural nomadic populations, or of course, people who live off the water and the oceans is absolutely central. And that's why it ties in with IG. Then, of course, the urban and infrastructure transition, which is very important. And, I described that earlier. The industrial one is probably less important at the current point of time, but depending on how one transitions and development pathways working out, it may be critical. But I would like to highlight the fifth one, which is very important. And we've seen this in the context of COVID. It is what we call the societal transition, bringing together citizens and a whole range of other stakeholders to align with the challenges and opportunities of sustainable development and building resilience. So we know from the science side, we know from the policy side that there are a whole range of options. There's an image towards the right there, which looks at a range of, there are 48 different technical options that are available across all of these systems. They've been assessed. We did that in 2018. We've just done just now from the IPCC just now, which is a set of feasible and effective adaptation and mitigation options. But how you deploy them is going to be different in different contexts. If you're sitting in Oceania and you're sitting in parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, the contexts are very different, the ecological context, the development context, etc. So localization, the application of all of these things that we know from other places and your own context is going to be the really important challenge. We have a global framework, but the global framework will depend on local delivery and the aggregation across, I would say, maybe 10 to 20,000 places across the world. And remember, we have about 3,000 days to do this if we have to deliver the SDGs by 2030. Of course, in the stock take, we may find that we are set back quite dramatically because of COVID, and that has to be taken into account at the same time. So I'm going to take two very quick cases. These are they're taken from real data, but I'm sort of anonymizing them. So this is an LDC case, a landlocked country. And what you can see here is the SDG framework. So you see on the right-hand side, the SDG dashboard, and if it's red, it basically means things are not very good, excepting when an arrow is pointing upwards, and the green, that means in this particular case, there's an improvement of poverty. And there are others in which you actually have a green sort of situation. So as I said, in the climate space, most LDCs are actually very important and supportive of the climate goals, primarily because emissions are low, right? But you can see the bulk of this dashboard is in the red or the brown region, which basically means that we have severe developmental challenges. And in this particular case, I want to highlight SDG 4, which is very critical to human development. I mean, you may have improvements in health, but if you're not doing much about education, in this particular country case, we actually have very poor data about education. So one of the core things is we have to have better information to be able to localize and implement this process. There are frameworks in place, and I've highlighted 3 blocks of the SDGs. The core ones, of course, are 8, 9, and 10, which are critical to economic development. They will have an impact on the upper right-hand
Mr. Ravi, I think that we need to start wrapping up.
About 3,000. The other ones will focus on the HDI of 0.48, because these are central to actually making the transition on the climate and the infrastructure side. Let me move to a very different case, and that is of a small island state. Again, you can see an HDI of about 0.5, so many challenges in the human development side, a GDP per capita, which is very similar to the other country that's there, and also biocapacity deficits. And this is, I think, a very important thing when we're talking about ecosystem resilience. Somewhat better in some cases than the previous country that we saw there, because on SDG 12 on sustainable production and consumption, because I guess that's relatively low, we don't have critical challenges. But similar structure here. You have to get the economy right and become resilient to a whole range of these shocks, especially when you have extreme events and climate kind of impacts that are there that will build over time. You will have impact on your infrastructure. That will have a knockdown effect on economic development and also on questions of health and education, which are central to that transition as far as they're concerned. So what will actually make this work? And I'm going to generalize here at a very high level. Obviously, in 10 minutes, it's very difficult to embrace all the diversity and the challenges that we have. But from what we understand, very critical interventions around SDG 16 and 17 are important in this. And I would say they're in 2 blocks, and I'll close with this slide just now. The first block is something that I would call endogenous. These are things that LDCs do have some control of. In fact, very significantly can chart their own pathways. If you don't have peace, I'm just closing in 15 seconds. If you don't have peace, you can't deliver resilience. You need to enable governance, to enable SDG localization. You need to build institutional capacity, and that's very much in your own hands. And finally, I think the most critical is citizen empowerment and stakeholder mobilization. However, given the condition of the LDCs, the partnerships, especially partnerships with the international system, are critical because of resource, HDI, and other constraints, in which I would say financing is absolutely critical. This is our most significant constraint. Technology is important, and without international cooperation and solidarity, this is not going to work for the LDCs, and because it does not work for the LDCs, it may not work for the rest of us in other parts of the world. So thank you very much. This was a provocation at a very high level. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much for these remarks, Mr. Revi, and I think that your sort of notion of living in a perfect storm in terms of sort of global development captures sort of our current situation very well. And I realized that I made the sort of, typical Finnish mistake, which is always going straight to the point, so I forgot to present myself. I'm Jukka Salovaara, the permanent representative of Finland to the United Nations. But now let's move on, and our first panelist is Mr. Syed Yusuf Sadat from the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh, who will present on climate change in Bangladesh, a sustainable development perspective. And I will try to do a better job in policing time, so you have 7 minutes, please. Do we have Mr. Sadat online?
Morning. Thank you, UNOHRLS and UNU for giving me this opportunity. Today, I'll be talking about my paper. It's called Climate Change in Bangladesh, a Sustainable Development Perspective. And this is a paper in which we did a small empirical exercise where we forecasted the prospects of achieving SDG 13 in Bangladesh by 2030. And the paper is there on the conference website. Unfortunately, due to lack of time, I won't be able to get into the nitty-gritty details of that today. But in general, I'll just go through some brief points which we made in the paper. And one of the issues is that Bangladesh right now is at the front line of climate change. Most of you are well aware that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries in the world. Even during the pandemic in 2020, we had a huge super cyclone which hit Bangladesh, and several thousands of people were homeless and a lot of damage was done. And climate change is directly basically threatening all the development progress that Bangladesh has made over the past 50 years. It has now been, it has moved from low-income country to lower middle-income country. It has moved from an LDC, it is going out of an LDC status by 2026, hopefully. And so climate change is threatening all this development progress that we have made. And anthropogenic climate change is also responsible for a lot of climate-induced natural disasters and extreme weather events, which we see every now and then in Bangladesh, particularly cyclones and floods and those sorts of things. But generally what we see is that there's a huge gulf between the rhetoric and the reality of climate change. We keep on talking about this, but unfortunately, when the time comes to act, we see that there is there is some lacking in that. And so in the upcoming COP21, I feel Bangladesh needs to draw support for an adaptation strategy, which will be comprehensive in nature. It will cover disaster management, climate resilience, and also it will involve all the international stakeholders. And it's very important for us to obtain finance for climate change adaptation, because if you look at the political economy of climate finance, then you'll see that most of the climate finance is for climate change mitigation, whereas for countries like Bangladesh, which have very low carbon emissions, climate change adaptation is much more important, because we are the ones who are facing the brunt of natural disasters, whereas the emissions and global warming is going on somewhere else. And therefore, we need a lot of climate finance. We need a new green technology that needs to come in. Foreign direct investment should be a vehicle for this kind of green investment. And we need to secure funding so that we can overcome the challenges of climate change and move out and build back better in a green economy. And I know this is quite obvious, but I want to stress this, that climate change is an existential threat to humankind. And this is not just for Bangladesh, this is for all countries of the world. And so the causes, the probable consequences of inaction would be catastrophic. It would be absolutely suicidal for all of us. And so on the global level, I think that the time has long passed for us to come to realization that a more circular approach to the economy is needed. We need to reduce, we need to reuse and recycle what we make and what we use, so that the pressure on natural resources and the environmental degradation is much lower. And so we need to scale up our adaptation measures. We need to implement our national adaptation plans quickly. We need to increase our investments in renewable energy, and we need more funding for climate change adaptation. And ultimately, SDG 13, climate action, climate change is a global issue, and no country by itself can actually resolve this problem. So we need to consider transboundary action and regional collaboration on climate change and SDG 13. And in the upcoming COP21, some of the things which we can consider is that national adaptation plans could be used as a means of measuring the progress on climate change. And we need to ensure more governance and transparency in managing our own climate funds, so that foreign investors are more encouraged to come here and invest, because sometimes it happens that it's a problem of governance. If there is a corruption or there's some other kind of issue, for that climate funds are not coming to Bangladesh. And we need novel strategies to deal with climate change, which are frugal, which are cost effective, and at the same time, which are effective in reducing emissions. And Bangladesh, along with other LDCs, they need to come together and jointly lobby for delivering the pledge of $100 billion in climate funds for developing countries, which the developed countries made. But those commitments are not being fulfilled at a time when the world is suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic. And poor people in LDCs such as Bangladesh are suffering from the double brunt of COVID-19 and climate change and climate-induced natural disasters. So now is the time we need this funding more than ever before. So I would like to thank you. I'd close this quickly, but please feel free to go in and read our paper and get in touch with us if you need to know more. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and keeping time. And I think that your message on adaptation is well heard. And next our next panelist is Mr. Eric M. Pondi Ndengle, who is an economist at the IMF, and will talk about adapting to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa. You have 7 minutes, please. I understand that Mr. Ndengle has some connection issues, so we will move to Mr. Luke Amadi, guest editor, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, who will present on Can Resilience Performance Scorecard further climate-smart agriculture for sustainable land use among the LDCs in Africa. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry, how do I operate it?
I don't really know.
I should be pressing here. Okay. Sorry. Can Resilience Performance Scorecard further climate-smart agriculture for sustainable agriculture among LDCs? Evidence from Angola. Over time, everybody is very much aware of issues of climate change vulnerability. But recent findings suggest that issues of resilience have not been given adequate attention in policy discourse. So what is resilience? Resilience is not a state of being, rather a set of capacities. In other words, resilience has to do with building the capacity of the least developed countries. We are talking about capacity for governance. How do we strengthen the capacity of the least developed countries to be able to withstand climate shock? So in this study, we tried to create a link between resilience performance and climate-smart agriculture. There are three major themes of climate-smart agriculture: productivity, adaptation and resilience, and then mitigation. The essence is to increase productivity, what we call green agriculture, because over time, the least developed countries are poor. They experience series of climate shock like drought, sea level rise, ocean surge, flooding. So these are the key issues, the problem of this study. Since 1971, when the UN created the LDCs category, Sub-Saharan Africans have dominated the list. And it's an issue of policy concern. There are about 33 African countries that are least developed. So they are confronted with severe low income, structural impediments to sustainable development, and highly vulnerable. In other words, they are vulnerable, climate vulnerability, and lots of challenges. Again, they live in extreme poverty, defined as less than 1.90% per day. So the context of this study focuses on Angola. Angola is one of the LDCs in Africa. Of course, it's the second richest oil-producing country in Sub-Saharan Africa, next to Nigeria. In fact, issues of climate change has become very important in Angola, particularly in the post-Civil War era. You know, the war lasted between 1992 to 2005. So the rural sector dominates. In fact, it is the second largest contributor of Angola's GDP, which is 9.4%. So there is high level of informality. The informal sector remains a dominant issue in Angola. Again, about 85% of Angolans are engaged in informal sector agriculture, which is primarily smallholder farming for subsistence. So there are severe climate risks. In fact, the particular experience of Angola has to do with flooding, sea level rise, drought, and coastal erosion. So the methodology is a qualitative approach. However, resilience performance scorecard has to do with how do we measure, what are the key indicators that suggest that these countries are resilient. And again, if we get to know these indicators, what can we do about them? I did mention earlier that there's need to build the capacity of these people. So we also looked at the IPCC's vulnerability framework. Also, we looked at some case examples. In fact, our study focused on Huambo region. It's a province in Angola. We also looked at data from UNOHRLS 2018, UNESDA 2001, World Bank 2021. This is the framework, Resilience Performance Scorecard. You look at climate risks. The first one there is drought. We undertook a qualitative evaluation of the level of resilience of Angolans to drought. Are there existing strategies of adaptive capacity? In other words, how have they been able to avert or minimize threats of risks through preventive measures, short-term coping strategies, incremental shifts in management practices? For example, how have the smallholder farmers invest in pesticides to control a seasonal pest outbreak in their farm? Key findings. The data showed climate vulnerability in about 84% of the total areas. Also, there is absence of climate-smart agriculture. There is also very high climate vulnerability due to non-resilience and weak institutional mechanisms. So let's just quickly go to actionable recommendations. Resilient performance is necessary because it will help to build. So what instruments or measures are adopted to understand the level of resilience? You know, there are various biophysical challenges, risks, diseases, animal, plants, and pests. So evidence shows that there is need for climate financing. Also, we are talking about digitization. There's also need to digitize. Then there's also need to build the capacity of the LDCs for resilience. Example, farmers and resilience stakeholders must understand resilience and match risks to resilience capacity. You know, there's also need to boost trade for African LDCs. We also suggested land reform, mechanized farming, and all of that. So there's also decline in soil fertility. You know, it's on and on and on and on. But more importantly, I think we should appeal to the high-income countries. We commend the Finland government, but we appeal to high-income countries to come to the aid of the least developed countries. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and I think that, well, developing agriculture and resilience is really a big theme that came out in many of the findings yesterday as well. And I think that we can now check whether Mr. Erik Pondi Endengle is online. Okay, so let's move on. So our next panelist is Mr. Luke Amadi, guest editor of the Cambridge Scholars Publishing, who will present on Can Resilience Performance Scorecards Further Climate Smart Agriculture for Sustainable Land Use among the LDCs in Africa. You have the floor, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
The next one.
The next one, yeah. So sorry for mixing the speakers list again. And we will hear from Bijoy Rakshit from the Indian Institute of Technology, ROPAR, who will present on the impact of poverty and urbanization on environmental degradation, evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Shall I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So a very good morning to everyone present in the meeting. I am Bijoy Rakshit from Indian Institute of Technology, ROPAR, and the title of my talk is Impact of Poverty, Urbanization on Environmental Degradation, Evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa. And this paper has been co-authored with Panika Jain and Dr. Shamresh Bardhan. So this is an overview of the background of the study. So there is a paradoxical connection between poverty and environmental degradation, and this paradoxical connection has been gaining a great deal of attention of policymakers and government stakeholders for several reasons. And this nexus between poverty and environmental degradation, it is a good issue to explore in sustainability and environmental literature as well. Masseron and Subramaniam, they have explained this connection with the remark that it's like killing two birds with one stone. However, the trade-off between poverty elevation and environmental degradation, it appears to be one of the policy issues, especially after the events such as United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Program. That's why the complexity and the significance of the poverty and environmental degradation, it has to be understood in the light of some institutional, macroeconomic, and demographic factors. And as we know that least developed countries are more susceptible to the problem of environmental risks as compared to the developed economics, and these countries are characterized by poor institutional qualities and low adaptive capacity, and their disproportionate reliance on the consumption of national resources. So these countries are in a So these countries are in a greater need of financial assistance in the form of development finance so that they can finance their future prospect of the sustainable development programs. However, in recent times, the broad objective of the development finance has been enlarged in the face of fulfilling multiple objectives, including poverty alleviation, environmental risks, and ensuring women rights, etc. However, if we look at most of the research that currently being carried out, they are mostly focusing on the environmental management, environmental conservations, and natural resources management, and paying very little importance to the effect of poverty and urbanization on environmental sustainability. UNEP 2011 in this regard, they have acknowledged that when a large volume of research is being carried out in the LDCs, and it shows that there is a poor implementation of the sustainable development in the achievement of sustainable environmental, economic, and society. However, the joint discourse on the dynamics of poverty and urbanization is a very crucial and the relevant aspect, but we do not find much studies happened on this issue in the context of the LDCs, and especially in the SSA region. Now, my entire topic, it is actually motivated from the SSA region, and I have been motivated by the following points. First of all, if we look at the transition phase of the Millennium Development Goals to the SDG, it is evident that across the global, the incidence of the extreme poverty has been falling, except the SSA region, and the growing incidence of the extreme poverty in the SSA region, it has also led to the creation of the problem of global poverty reduction in the world. So this is a very important issue that needs more policy intervention and more policy discussions. And in the entire dynamics between the poverty and environmental degradation, poors are both perceived as both the perpetrators and the victims of the environmental pollution. In fact, World Bank forecasts indicate that by 2030, nearly 9 out of 10 extremely poor people will be living in extreme poverty in the SSA region. Now, if we talk about the issue of urbanization, if we talk about the issue of urbanization, it has been projected that by 2050, from 8.7% in 1990 to 22.3% people, the global share of the urban population from the SSA region will be 22.3% by the 2015.
Well, I think that we may have reached the end of the presentation, and I want to thank our presenter, and at the same time, I need to apologize that I understand the French translation didn't work because of the echo we heard online. And I hope I'm not now making any mistakes with the list, and our next panelist is Mr. Eric Mpondi Ndengle, who is an economist at the IMF and will talk about adapting to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please. You are online, please. You need to unmute, please.
Thank you, Chair. So today I will be talking about adapting to climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the key questions here are how Sub-Saharan Africa is affected by weather-related disaster, and what can we do to make the region more resilient to these shocks. So let's talk a bit about background. Climate change broadly means rising temperature and increasing rainfalls anomalies. So the left charts here show that the world temperature has been increasing, particularly since the 1980s. and the effect on frequency and intensity of weather-related disaster are important. So we see on the right chart that the frequency of natural disaster has been rising, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what is the economic impact of climate change in Sub-Saharan Africa? We did some regression analysis in which we proxied economic activity with nightlight data. So basically nightlight data regressed on weather anomalies, where anomalies are extreme temperature and precipitation, basically a deviation from a 30-year average. We find that anomalies impact economic activity, but by much more in Sub-Saharan Africa than in the rest of the world. The effect is even higher for the Sahel region, which reflects actually the region's lack of resilience to climate change and highlights the need to rapidly develop adaptation measures. So how do we respond? We have two approaches, basically. So the first one is through mitigation, which is to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, or adaptation, which is to adjust to changes in the climate. So regarding mitigation, Sub-Saharan Africa has limited influence on climate change compared with advanced economies or large emerging markets. Therefore, adaptation seems to be more important for Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me outline here some key considerations and policy recommendations. So the priority is to safeguard food security. Our analysis shows that some key factors can reduce the chances of food insecurity. Access to finance will help households to provide at difficult time and allow them to invest in resilience ahead of a shock. Access to mobile network, allow use of early warning system and give farmers important information on food prices and weather. For example, a simple text message can help a farmer decide when to plant or irrigate. We also have a positive effect from better built homes, which can help with food storage and good sanitation, which ensures safe drinking water. We display the results here for Ethiopia. The bottom two bars show the average probability of food insecurity following a shock for a household with and without these key factors. And we see that actually there's a very large gap in predicted probabilities of food insecurity of over 40 percentage points. We also show that there is a scope to improve crop yields, and we show examples here from Ethiopia and Rwanda. What policy areas will be most critical for Sub-Saharan Africa to adapt to climate change? For each type of disaster, this chart shows policy variables that help improve the resilience. As an example, an improvement in electricity up to the average level in emerging and developing economies will help in case of a drought, improve growth by 0.4 percentage point. Another example is an improvement in health up to the average of emerging and developing economies will help in case of a flood, improve growth. In that case, for example, the explanation will come from the fact that improved health care help people return to work quickly after a shock. An important issue is that resilience building measures are generally expensive. So how do we finance them? Sub-Saharan Africa countries have limited fiscal space. The COVID pandemic is taking a toll on the region already limited fiscal space. Some countries have large public debt. There are competing financing needs for sustainable development goals. There is some scope for improving spending efficiency and revenue mobilization with regard to resilience building, but progress seems to be slow. So therefore, this implies that the role of the international community is important, but the investment now will be far less costly than the price of frequent disaster relief in the future. As the charts here shows, saving from reduced post-disaster spending could be many times the cost of upfront investment in building resilience. Therefore, Contribute to resilience building is good for donors because it's more welfare enhancing, and it's also good for Sub-Saharan Africa countries because they face a huge challenge from climate change. To conclude, empowering people, enhancing infrastructure, strengthening coping mechanism, these three policy areas could be considered, particularly when countries are designing policy to support the recovery. This policy will make the economy more resilient, but could also create jobs. Economic recovery from the pandemic and policies addressing climate change must go together to ensure a future for Sub-Saharan Africa that is most equitable, more sustainable, and more resilient. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and actually that was really perfect timing. And next on my list, we have Mr. Sorry. Yes, yeah, thank you. And next on my list, we have Mr. Kirambo, who is here present, and who will present from the Seeds of Opportunity in Malawi to make his presentation on new paradigms for non-state actor-led financing for sustainable development goals and Paris Agreement in least developed countries, policy insights from Sub-Saharan Africa and Malawi. You have the floor, please.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dumi Chirambo. I just, first of all, want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for giving me this opportunity to actually disseminate my research to a wider audience. So I will be talking about climate financing. I will not talk much about the impacts of climate change because my colleagues have already discussed that, but I'll be talking about social innovation and bottom-up financing for climate change projects. So it's slightly different from what you've been hearing. Climate change impacts, there are many. We've got the probability of increased disasters. We've also got the issues of climate refugees, which we have to consider in the future. And where I come from, it's about the climate finance gap. I think most of the other speakers mentioned that developing countries are in dire need of financing. So where would that money come from? The problem we have is that aid is on the decrease, whilst the vulnerabilities are increasing. So what do? I design models for climate financing, and we look at how we can actually turn challenges into opportunities. So as you know, cities or urbanization is a big thing nowadays in Africa or in developing countries. So we are going to have more people moving into cities, and that can actually exacerbate greenhouse gas emissions as well as vulnerability of people. There are different concepts that we can use. Maybe some of you know about circular economies, where we actually recycle materials. For example, instead of throwing away plastics, you can actually mix plastic with other building materials, and then that is also a sustainable stream of creating jobs and incomes. But today I'll talk about the framework which we designed, which is basically trying to help local authorities to design better buildings or to improve in their urban development paradigms. I will just talk about the things that are more important to this discussion as to how we actually raise money using this framework. So, for example, in Malawi, we build a lot of our houses using bricks, and the bricks are burnt in kilns. So in that process, we cut down a lot of trees. So the first thing to do is to consider what building materials we use. For example, you can use soil-stabilized blocks or even cement blocks, and those have got a less impact on the environment. The other concept that we use in our development paradigm is where we say that in an average house or a local house or a social house, we can actually do a model where 10% of the rent actually goes towards building projects or actually afforestation or climate change adaptation projects. So the idea is to have a sustainable stream of income every month, and then you aggregate that, and then you see when I do the models later on that the number actually increases. And then the last part is where you use technologies like renewable energy technologies, solar voltaic, and also solar water heaters. So how does that work in the real sense? If we look at Malawi, our deficit is about 60,000 dwellings, which we have to build so that we actually supply all the affordable housing. If we use the framework which I used, for example, just by using 10% of the 200 monthly rentals, you come up with 1.2 million every month. I can explain that later on, but that is what we talk about when we talk about bottom-up financing, where we're not actually looking at donors, but we're actually looking at what is within the actual community. But it doesn't end there. As I spoke earlier on about our project, we are putting in new innovations, so we can actually also create carbon credits because we are building sustainable houses. So in our project, we built 5 sustainable houses, and from the calculations there, you can see that just by replacing the bricks with cement blocks, we actually had a carbon emission reduction of 52 tons. And then also because 40% of the energy used in houses goes towards water heating, just by replacing solar water heaters with, electric heaters with solar water heaters, we also managed to achieve a 12% carbon emission. And again, for every house we were building, we were planting 100 trees. So that was about 500 trees, and then we added a few more, and then we actually had a carbon mitigation factor of a carbon offset of about 10 tons of carbon emissions. If you actually sell those emissions on a voluntary carbon market, then you came up with that figure, which is about $764. So that's how the whole cycle works, that you are not actually asking for donors for money, but just by building differently, you can actually bring in different pieces of concepts to actually generate the money. And then if you add that with the rentals every month, then you're coming up with $2,000. So basically, that's how we can actually do it. And if you look at how many houses we want to build about 60,000, then you can do the calculations and you see that it actually gets to be quite a substantial sum. So that is how our bottom-up approach actually works. And I think the last one, I'll just talk about the thing about the structural transformations in the agriculture sector. Africa imports about $35 billion worth of food. So if you also actually look at it in another way, you can say that LDCs have got the potential to invest in the agricultural systems to actually displace the imports which come into Africa. And then how that works is that it has to be a top-down actually approach. You have to see which countries are actually importing that food and what food is actually being imported in those countries. And then you have to give the LDCs, for example, like in Malawi, most of the crops we grow, it's maize because we only look at subsistence. But if we were to actually think of the other countries that import different types of crops, we would actually be able to displace that. So it's the transformation that actually looks at what is actually in need, and then that actually calls for interventions from other people so that it is actually done systematically. So that's my presentation for now. And yes, so what I just wanted to say was, again, when you look at green investments, don't just look at it from the renewable energy sector. You can actually look at how we've done our concept there, where we're actually looking at urban development as a green investment. Of course, for that to happen, we need sorts of legislations, or we need a push from the government so that the builders are actually incentivized to actually adopt our approach. So that is the next thing that maybe I might need some help from other people to say, how can we actually design this to scale it up or to replicate? But as you can see from my calculations, we've done it as a pilot, and then the next step is just moving on up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and really looking at building materials sort of gave us a fresh perspective on what can be done. And now we will turn to our discussant, our colleague, His Excellency Mr. Samuelu Laloniu, a permanent representative of Tuvalu to the United Nations. If you are connecting from New York, we all realize in a way that it's night there. So thanks for taking the time with us, dear colleague. You have the floor, please, for 4 minutes.
Well, first of all, let me thank all our distinguished panelists, and thank you, Ambassador Juga, for leading our discussion. And yes, I'm joining from New York, and it's a pleasure to be with friends of LDC. I think one thing is very clear from the presentations, and it is that we are all, as LDCs, impacted the most as far as climate change is concerned. But within our grouping of LDC, there are stark differences in how some of us are affected. I think over the years we have seen places where we once considered safe, no longer safe now, and places where we consider or we saw as vulnerable are now extremely vulnerable. And Tuvalu is one of those places that is now extremely vulnerable to climate change. And I want to bring to our discussion the context of Tuvalu as an atoll nation. And that is, as an atoll nation, we are no more than 2 meters above sea level. So climate change is our single greatest threat to livelihood and prosperity and the security of our people. In fact, climate change is an existential threat, as some of our previous speakers have also mentioned. In our case, 2 meters above sea level, the science is predicting our total submersion within this century. So for us, the intervention we use to adapt and to build resilience must be effective, but also it must be implemented with urgency at a pace that should keep us a step ahead of sea level rise. The point also is that for atoll nations, the tipping points are much closer than when an atoll nation eventually becomes submerged. This is because decades before an atoll nation is submerged, atoll nations will not be able to support life because the groundwater and the water security and food security is severely compromised by sea level rise. And when I say that, in Tuvalu right now, as we speak, we are living with that those impacts. So atoll nations brings a very critical case for discussion. Our adaptation interventions and must be effective, but also with utmost urgency. And failing that, we atoll nations will have to deal with very sensitive and difficult political questions of sovereignty, statelessness, human rights, and so forth. So adaptation is number one priority in the cases of Tuvalu and I think also other atoll nations. So living with this sense of fear and uncertainty, Tuvalu, including the Pacific Island Forum, agreed to a regional initiative. And that is how we should protect our EEZs, our economic, our maritime zones. So in 2019, the Pacific committed to a collective effort, including to develop international law with the aim of ensuring that once a forum members' maritime zones are delineated according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that those maritime zones should not be challenged or reduced by the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. So in August this year, our Pacific leaders endorsed a Pacific Regional Normative Declaration on Permanency of Maritime Zones, including ownership of the resources in those zones. So that is a response from the region, a regional response. And we also ask that similar regional cooperation in other regions can also look at that at our Pacific Initiative, and perhaps to have a more responsive international response to the specific situation of those of us who are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. I heard a lot of the panelists spoke about finance, climate finance, and we do share that, but I want to bring to our discussions an important issue that's specific of atoll nation, and that is the challenge of developing bankable projects. Because in the case of Tuvalu, we have a population of 11,000 people, 26 square kilometers of land. We extremely lack the scale, the scale of economy that we can attract investment into our projects to enhance our resilience and adapt. So this is an issue that I think policies going forward for LDC and look at the scale, the challenge of a scale of economy that some of us who are very vulnerable to climate change. I will stop here and thank you very much, Ambassador Juba.
Well, thank you so much, Samuelu, for connecting with us and for your views, and also sort of introducing new angles like maritime boundaries and climate change. And I think that we now have some 20 minutes for an interactive discussion, and I would like to encourage all participants, both in the room and participating virtually, to ask questions and share their views and experiences. I would like to ask you to introduce yourselves when you take the floor, and if you are joining virtually, please type your name, title, and country or organization into the chat to be added to the speakers list, and outline your question, statement, or comment. I would also like to ask you to limit your intervention to a minute to enable as many interventions as possible. So, dear friends, this is the opportunity to ask our eminent experts, both here present and online. I feel like I'm at an auction house. And the first bid goes to Perks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yuka, and all the speakers, very elaborate and informative. My question is to Dumi from Malawi. It's very interesting and innovative that instead of looking at climate financing from the donor perspective, you are bringing in, domestic sources of financing. I wish you take this forward to the policymakers in your country and other countries to propagate this and move it forward to implementation. My question is, you say for every building that you come up with, you take, is it 10% or 12%?
Yeah, we can work on the model. It can be from 5 to 10%. Ours, we did 10% because we had a grant. But if you are a private investor, then maybe you can reduce it to 5%.
So you get that money and put in a fund?
Yes. So the idea is that at the beginning, you can actually choose a community that you want to help. So for us, we had a few schools and 2 communities where we're saying that every month we'll be giving you X amount of money. How many trees can you be planting with this money and managing with that money? So it's just about the planning ahead. If you are building maybe 200 houses, then you can actually also think about it that maybe you should go into something that is bigger, a bigger investment. But that was the idea.
Very good, very innovative, and I like that presentation. Thank you.
And this was a very concrete angle, and I'm looking for sort of bids in a way that were. And while we are waiting for sort of more questions, perhaps I can abuse my role as moderator and then ask Mr. Amadi, and you made a very good case about sort of really sort of in investing in agriculture and how that's a good way to build resilience. But of course, sort of financing is always a big part of the issue in a way. And since we heard a very good example from Malawi about sort of also tapping into domestic resources, and I could imagine that sort of microfinancing projects could be very useful for agriculture. So what would be your angle to sort of the financing issue and agriculture?
Yes, that's lovely. That's lovely. You know, financing in agriculture is important for the least developed countries because they are largely agrarian and informal sector. So to me, I think it's necessary to encourage them. The major challenge in agricultural practices in the least developed countries are climate vulnerability. So to overcome this, there's need for climate financing. So I believe that climate financing is essential in terms of overcoming the vulnerability of the least developed countries. For instance, in Angola, there was a time, we had a severe drought. So building their resilience by providing alternative mechanisms is essential. So thank you. So climate financing, I think, is very, very necessary.
Dear friends, there is space and... Oh, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, moderator. Diego Valadares from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I'd like to make a question linked to 2 recent reports of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, mandate holder from the Human Rights Council. The last one from this year on climate action from a right to development perspective, and the previous one from 2019, I believe, on disaster risk reduction, Sendai framework, and so on. And in both these reports, you make very strong recommendations on the importance of participation of those that are most affected by climate-related disasters in policy making. So I'd like to hear from the panelists if they could speak a little bit about how do they see the importance, or how do they see in their findings as well, the voices of those who are most affected, and what recommendations would they make to policymakers on ensuring a broader participation to bring to the forefront concerns of those that are most affected by climate disasters?
Thanks for the great question, and perhaps I could sort of first invite Mr. Revi to comment on these questions, but of course, the opportunity is there for other panelists as well, and then we will move on to the back row with Sophia for further questions. But Mr. Revi, if you're online, your comments are very welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think this is a very critical question, because without mobilization of communities and the most vulnerable, we cannot reduce vulnerability. I mean, most of the efforts in many parts of the world to reduce vulnerability sort of top down haven't worked very effectively, especially in the climate context. Community-based adaptation that's linked to what we call ecosystem-based adaptation is really the most effective. And Bangladesh, for example, is one of the great examples of that, in the disaster risk context. But having said that, if the economic and the development base is continually being eroded, then you have no place to start from. So I'll be very sort of frank and direct in saying this is fundamentally a development challenge. And to address LDC developmental challenges, it's not only a question of climate finance. It is that development finance has to flow and flow very effectively. And as we've seen in the post-COVID process, a lot of the OECD countries have committed trillions of dollars of investment to recovering their economies, but the flow to many other parts of the world, especially the LDCs, is weak. So climate finance is an additionality. It's important. It needs to be focused on adaptation, but we do need to see development finance moving and also the building of capacities inside government to strengthen community and other responses. Else vulnerability will not come down. And if you do not address vulnerability, you cannot build resilience, irrespective of how much you would like.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Revi. And there's a further question from the chat room, and which is how can we differentiate between climate finance and development finance for LDCs? So perhaps, Mr. Revi, you could take this question as well.
I'll take that too. So actually, there's a significant overlap in that. When we're talking about, let's say, in the agriculture sector, when we're talking about trying to increase drought resilience, and you're trying to do that by dealing with both surface and groundwater, there is a deep convergence between the two. In fact, the Green Climate Fund is deeply challenged in some ways in trying to organize their climate financing, because we do not have adequate evidence of how much split there should be between, let's say, mitigation finance, which is where the bulk of climate finance goes. And again, I'll be maybe a little direct and somewhat sort of provocative. The 100 billion we're talking about per year is actually a fraction of what is needed to effect the climate transition. But the development transition will require even more. So actually, if you bring them both together, you're able to address this. And unfortunately, our systems are very siloed in terms of financing, both in the international framework, but also inside many of our countries. So I would say convergence is important. We do need to make sure the resources get to where they are, and we need to empower resource mobilization from the communities, the local and regional governments, where much of this action will take place. So our frameworks are just not up to the task of mobilization and moving the resources to where they're required.
Thank you so much. And next we have a few questions from the floor, and let's start with the DPR from Liberia. Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir. To my brother from Malawi, with respect to the climate change and the microfinance, how do you see women getting involved, or the importance of women contributing? Thank you.
So yes, in our project, we also try to mainstream gender roles. So for example, with the communities we are working with, some of the people who were actually looking after the trees were women. And we've also got, we had a training component where we're actually training people to mold cement blocks, and some of those were also women. So we did try to incorporate that in our project, so it's possible. Yeah.
Thank you, an important question, and we have a question from Bangladesh, and then we will move to Eritrea.
Thank you, moderator. So my name is Devabroto Chakraborty. I come from Geneva. I represent Bangladesh mission there, but I'm also the LDC groups, expert groups, focal point on LDC graduation in Geneva. So it's an open question on technology, and particularly impacts of climate. So it's an open question, any panelist or keynote speaker can answer. That what do you find the impact of technology or the relevance of technology transfer, better to say, mitigating or addressing these climate challenges, particularly on agriculture, and what are the challenges that you see there transferring technology to LDCs? Thank you so much.
Thank you, and while panelists think about sort of answering this important question, let's give the microphone to the PR of Eritrea. Sophia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Of course, congratulations to all the panelists and the excellent work that you're doing and presenting here. But referring to climate resilience, I'm thinking of Eritrea. We're a very drought-prone country. And one of the things that we did at a community level, without waiting for the finances from the outside, was to build as many dams around the country as we can to harness every single drop of rainwater. That was one of the things that we did. And the second thing we did was every high school, elementary school, and college students were also planting trees in their environment, in their college, around their dorms, in the houses, in the complexes. And then, of course, my favorite, diaspora. Every time we go home, for every martyr's family, every Independence Day, we are planting trees, 1 tree per person as you go in there, and that also helps to finance some of the seedlings that the Ministry of Agriculture distributes. So there's many ways to skin this cat, and I think sometimes we need to look more inside our own countries to see what we can do from within our communities, both the diaspora and the inside the country. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and let's give the chance to Perks, a PR of Malawi, also to add to the questions to our distinguished panelists.
Thank you. Mine is not a question per se, but a note for information. We have in the LDC group a ministerial declaration on the local climate adaptation living facility. This is called LOCAL in short. This is a UNCDF initiative that is looking at the possibilities of financing adaptation in LDCs. It's already working, and I'm very glad to tell you that governments, donor governments like Sweden, Liechtenstein, Andorra, Belgium, Korea, and others have already joined. There is a pool of funds that these donors bring in, and they go, UNCDF goes to local communities, villages or municipalities, ask them what their problem is on climate change, especially on adaptation, and help them to come up with projects that can be implemented using this facility. This facility was already adopted by the ambassadors in New York, of LDC ambassadors, to be one of the facilities to be promoted and used by all those who would want to finance adaptation in LDC countries. And we are going to COP26 with this. We have written to the chief of party of the British government about this facility and that it should be recognized and adopted. The good thing about this facility is that there is direct link between the financiers and the local people. So you know what the needs of the local people are, and you can finance that directly. The ministerial declaration, I will give it to the organizers here, if you don't have it already, so that it's circulated to everybody. I thank you.
Oh, thanks, Perks, for the intervention. And I think that the good thing about sort of meetings like this is really making sort of, well, unknown knowns into known knows in a way, that now we know that sort of, and that this is very much available. I think that we are sort of soon wrapping up, but I will allow for one more question, please.
Hello, Anna Toppari from UNU Wider, and I just wanted to thank for all the great presentations, and I especially want to thank Rashoy Bishui Rakshit for bringing this complexity into the table, because I've been struggling with that a lot. Like, we are, of course, aiming to decrease poverty, but at the same time doing it in an environmentally sustainable way. So I would just like to hear maybe some comments from the presenters on this. Will this be possible, or is it always kind of the economic growth first and then let's think about the environment? Will this be possible actually to do it in an environmentally sustainable way, and what could be the ways forward in this? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that we have now sort of very good questions about the environment, how you can engage the local communities, and then also how to use technology. And so before we wrap up, I will give our panelists a chance to respond, and then I think that we are having coffee next door, so we can all also to nurture our jet lags. But perhaps I can turn to our panelists first here present, Mr. Amadi and Mr. Kirambo, if you would like to take any of these sort of questions on communities, environment, and technology.
Okay, yeah, I can
Please.
start. Yeah, about the technology, I think it's more about adopting the right technologies, because I know that most of in my other projects, we used to do renewable energy. Why is it that people in villages don't adopt renewable energy? But then it's just because it's sometimes too complicated for the people, and it's a question of modifying it and making sure that they find use in it, and of course they can also afford it. So affordability and ease of use are the things that maybe hinder the use or the adoption of technologies in some circumstances.
Thank you. And what I noted in, for example, the presentation by Mr. Ndengle was that sometimes technology can be as simple as a text message, in a way that you have a right connection and the right information from producer to markets. Mr. Amadi, would you like to inject?
Yes, environmental sustainability, community-based environmental sustainability, a bottom-top approach, involving the local people in preserving the natural environment is essential, and it is practicable. There's need for advocacy at the local level, awareness, engaging the CSOs. So economic growth and sustainable development in terms of environmental sustainability is achievable and is very key to Agenda 2030. But the least developed countries should not be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you. And would Mr. Revi like to sort of comment on these last questions, please?
Thank you. I'll also comment to a question. I'll respond to a question in the chat. The core thing, I think, is in the chat that development finance does need to promote climate resilient development. That's, I think, the core organizing principle as far as finance is concerned. And there's also going to be an entire spectrum. You know, in some LDCs, and we heard from the PR in Tuvalu, it is almost impossible to think about bankability as far as projects are concerned. You have to deal with questions of, you know, sovereignty, of climate justice to be able to try and address those questions. On the other end of the spectrum, there are LDCs who are making the transition into sort of, you know, low middle income kind of status, etc. So we have to tailor the framework depending on what the context is. But to expect things to be completely financed without transfers in some cases is just not going to work. Technology is very important, and I'll just highlight one very simple thing. I think pretty much universal access to digital technology, especially cell phones and telecommunication, is going to be very important for climate services, because we have satellite information now pretty much across the world at very high resolution. It should be possible for us not only to do emergency response and early warning, but also help farmers, pastoralists, and people in informal settlements in cities to try and respond to questions of, let's say, extreme weather, or drought, or flooding well in advance. But you need connectivity for that. That's not very expensive, and it's very easy to deploy if we're able to get the right mixture of public and private finance and technology together. So that's one example of a remarkably good win that could be easily connected up.
Thank you so much, Mr. Revi. And I would just like to check if Mr. Ndengle from the IMF is still online and whether he would like to perhaps comment on the questions.
Of technology. So in our analysis, we show that actually mechanization, telecommunication, and electricity have a significant impact on reducing the effect of climate-related disasters on growth. Those three elements are related to technology, and between those three, electricity is the one that has the biggest impact actually. And this is interesting because when we talk about electricity, we're talking about all the research and development that has to be done in terms regarding developing new sources of electricity, renewable source of electricity. So the place of technology is very important in that picture. So and also we have to keep in mind, as some other panelists said, that this is very also related to development financing. And when we're talking about development, we're talking about everything that related basically also to technology, because technology is also a factor of production. So I think the place of technology in this kind of in this assessment is very important, and we need to look and we need to take it very, very, very seriously. And to finish on that specific point, I need to say that I have to tell that the effect on growth are very important. And when we think about the SDGs, like 30 years ahead, we see that, for example, by raising just simple things like housing, just simple things like maybe providing some small things to population, this can provide a big effect on adaptation, and this can have a huge effect on growth. So basically, technology is very important for growth, for long-term growth, and that's something we definitely have to look and to work for going forward on the policy end.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ndengle, and let's check whether we have still Mr. Rakshit online, whether he would like to comment. Mr. Rakshit, you have the floor.
Yeah, I would like to say that in our study, what we have found that this SSA region gets the maximum share of the development finance. And if the development finance is directed towards the program of poverty alleviation or to build the energy efficient infrastructure, especially in the urban region, and to also give sustainable housing facilities to the poor who are being migrated from the rural area to urban. So it can lead to the problem, it can actually reduce the problem of environmental degradation in the SSA region. So that is one of the policy implications that I would like to add from my side, and that's something our study has found.
Thank you so much, and I think that this is now a good moment to wrap up, and can I just sort of, warmly thank our panelists for your insights, and I really must sort of, thank you because, you make things sound so simple in a way that, it's, there are sort of very simple things that we can do, so I think that the responsibility in this room is just to make it happen. And I think that we all will sort of, come out of this meeting with a strong understanding that, adaptation is sort of so connected to resilience, and resilience is important for LDCs. And I think that we also sort of, heard very powerful examples, sort of, whether it's in agriculture or construction, in a way that, it's very important to engage the local communities, and sometimes sort of policy making is very much sort of, top down, but it's really sort of the bottom up approach that sort of brings very concrete results. So let's give a big hand to our panelists. And there's coffee next door.